separately, and then I'll ask people to introduce themselves. Agenda item 1, appeals against refusal. I'm not aware of any. Agenda item 2, exempt information. There is none. Agenda item 3, there was one late item, which was an email from George Hall circulated, I think, to everybody. Agenda item 4, declarations of interest. I'm sure that if you'd got any, you would have declared them already. Agenda item 5, apologies for absence and notification of substitutes. We've got Councillor Renshaw here. Welcome, Karen, who is substituting for Councillor Lisa Martin. Councillor Sharp has sent her apologies, and we've also got apologies from Martin Farrington for agenda item 7 and Gillian MacLeod for agenda item 8. Okay, now I've got that out of the way, I will do the introductions. So going around the table, probably that's the best way rather than my shouting out alphabetical order. So we'll start with you, Bob.
Jonathan Bentley, councillor for Wheatwood.
Councillor Neil Buckley or Woodley Ward.
Councillor Jonathan Taylor, Horsforth and Rawdon.
Councillor Paul Wadsworth, Guards in Rawdon Ward.
Sorry, Daniel Fryer, Belford BT.
Councillor Matthew Robinson from the Harewood Ward.
Adrian Hodgson, Highways and Transportation, Network Management Section.
Rob O'Brien, Principal Engineer for Highways and Transportation.
David Varley, Principal Legal Officer, Legal Services.
Wake up, Gary. Go on, if you shout, we will hear you. Morning.
Morning, everybody. Councillor Arfison from Gipton Hare Hills.
Morning, everybody. I'm Katie Dye, councillor for Killingbeck and Seacroft.
Morning, everybody. Councillor Karen Renshaw from Housing Robin Hood, substituting for Councillor Martin.
Andy Booth, Governance Services, Clerk to the Scrutiny Board.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm Councillor Paul Truswell. I represent Middleton and Belle Isle, and I chair this scrutiny board. Okay, moving on to agenda item 6, the minutes and notes. We have to agree the minutes of the meeting held on the 7th of April because I think we haven't been able to approve them at a properly constituted meeting since that time. So I'll just go through them in the time-honoured fashion, page by page. Any points you want to raise or any corrections, please just shout out. So page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, and page 9. So can I take it that the board are agreeable to my signing these as a true record of that meeting? Okay, right. And I think we're also expected to acknowledge the meeting that took place on the 22nd of July. That's my understanding, Becky, although that's not a formal part of the meeting. So on page 11, just going through again, if you've got any comments or any matters arising, any corrections, please shout up. So page 11, page 12, page 13, and page 14. Okay, thank you. That takes us on to agenda item 7, which is obviously the referral that we received from Councillor Matthew Robinson relating to the temporary closure of the road in his ward, Skulls. And I'm not going to do any great introduction other than to say the floor is yours, Matthew. Normally we would allow 10 minutes for you to explain to us why you want us to look at this as a scrutiny board. We're not to the odd minute here or there. So basically your time starts now.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the scrutiny boards. And I will try and err on the side of brevity because I know that you will have read the papers. The referral was made on the 12th of July, and we are now at a stage where the temporary closure has ended. The road is now back open. But I think that this is more than the decision about closing the road. It's the process and what goes behind it, and making sure that that is sound and that residents are included and involved in that process, and that there is suitable oversight as well. I noted in my referral that I wanted to look at the decision to close Leeds Road, how the decision was reached, and the information shared and the process of doing that. I think there are many residents in Skulls, but actually those in other wards that neighbour the village of Skulls, who are unhappy at the way that the process was reached, the way the process was conducted, and the decision to close Leeds Road, the cumulative impact that had on the community, on residents, on businesses, and it is very, very difficult for residents to understand why that 6-week closure was brought forward when it was never advertised earlier in the process and never communicated earlier with residents, and particularly with the e-law working group as well. The remit of this council is to look at being citizen focused, and there is a definite feel from the community that this is not citizen focused. The way that we conduct consultations across the council, but the way that the e-law process is run, has not allowed residents to be able to feed into the process and help shape it beyond what was the original planning application. I think there is a definite feeling from many residents that working groups are cursory, that they are not allowed or able to help share and influence what's coming forward. And that doesn't engender us to be a council that's looking to be citizen focused and looking to make sure that we are representing our residents. And particularly when you think of big infrastructure projects like this, my own view is that in business, we will be looking at having a review process. And that review process has to go beyond just the director or the executive member. Actually, it should include scrutiny, looking at a road scheme that's a £200 million road scheme. There needs to be far more oversight. There needs to be a process that we engage in. The statement, residents such as Mr. Hall have explained that the statement of community involvement has not been met, but also in doing all this, the impact on the wider network as well. There are a number of roads that were all closed at the same time, which meant that the capacity of the infrastructure network in and around East Leeds was fit to bursting. It would have only taken one incident to cause a significant problem. And I refer to Leeds Festival as a good example of that. Leeds Festival saw additional roads closed. Leeds Road was then closed. That had a massive impact. That was on top of road closures in Garforth and Temple Newsham and Crossgates and Winmore. So in signing that off for the closure of Leeds Road, that creates huge difficulties for the network, huge difficulties for residents, huge difficulties in terms of capacity. And those additional closures, we need to make sure that we understand not what's just happened with Leeds Road and what's happened with this particular closure, but it's actually understanding all future closures as well and what this might involve. The A64 will be closed at occasions to facilitate e-law opening. That is a major A road. The A58 will be closed as well on occasion. So this is going to have an enormous difficulty, not just on Skulls. And I'm keen to stress to the board that while I'm looking at Leeds Road and Skulls, it goes beyond that. And it is that North and East Leeds community in totality. Finally, Chair, I would note that there have been residents who put FOI requests in and sought to try and find out information and feel that that has not been particularly helpful or constructive. That the perception, whether it is reality or not, is that there is something to hide. And I think transparency needs to be the word of the day. We need to make sure that we're open, we're clear with residents. Some residents will not like e-law being built. I fully understand that. But it ain't going anywhere. It is going to be finished. It is going to be built. What we need to make sure we do, though, is that we work with the community to do it. We make sure we understand that, because there'll be 4,000 houses that come after it. This is going to be a long, ongoing process, and we need to get it right now to make sure that we stand ourselves in good stead in the future. The last comment I would make, Chair, is that there'll be many residents who are watching this on the webcast. If Scrutiny does decide to take this forward and to look into it further, I am certain that they would happily come to any working group, look to give evidence and look to supply anything that the Scrutiny board would like that would aid your discussions and your deliberations on this as well. I'll pause there and happy to answer any questions, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew. At this stage, I'm going to ask the officers to respond to any of the issues that they feel need elucidation from what Councillor Robinson has said, and any other points that they want to make at this stage. But again, within that initial 10-minute constraint, then I will throw it open to board members for questions and comments.
Okay, Chair, thank you. If I say a few words then, the first thing to say is obviously we apologise for any inconvenience caused by the roadworks that we carry out on the highway network. We work very hard to minimise that as much as possible. But given the amount of work that is taking place, not just by ourselves, but by developers and utilities, that is a challenge sometimes. But we do seek to mitigate any impact as much as we can. I think the report that's in the paper covers many of the points that have been raised, but I would just draw out a few if I may. Highway legislation is very clear here in terms of a clear distinction between the process relating to permanent orders and temporary road closure orders. Permanent road closure orders, where we're bringing something into effect permanently, obviously, requires set amount of consultation and engagement. Temporary highway legislation, legislation relating to temporary orders is different in that if the highway authority, using its experience and knowledge of the network, deems that a road closure is necessary for works, it does have the authority to bring about that closure. And the highway legislation is very specific. It's a very short period of notice. It's, David will correct me, it's 7 to 10 days. Notice has to be posted, and then a week later, the order can be made. So that's the legal side of it. And that, excuse me, that's section 14 of the Road Traffic Regulation Act 1984. There is no right of objection to those road closures if the highway authority deems it necessary, and we're required only to consult with the fire and the police. Now, I say that just because I'm setting the legislative background, but we seek clearly to do much more than that. And in this instance, we did seek to do more than that, including notifying the working group as soon as a decision was recommended to us about a road closure. And we did consult, obviously, with the emergency services and at length with the ambulance service on several occasions because of the feedback, quite rightly and understandably, being received. We followed that up. So the key thing here is making sure that that original decision to seek a closure is appropriate, and that is checked. That's as a normal process for checking that by obviously the contractor involved who's recommending it in this design and build contract. But then it's checked by the client, the client that is supervising the work, but then also by my network management colleagues. Adrian can expand on that if need be, who take into account, well, is that the right way of doing the work? And how does that impact the wider network? And that was done in this instance. And clearly, because we did do some advanced notification beyond the 7 days that I've mentioned before, obviously we did receive feedback from local councillors and from the community, and all that process was checked probably on several occasions to make sure that original decision to close the road, or the need to close the road, was sound, and that was what was done. There was no alternative at that stage. Once that decision or that recommendation is made, it's then a collective, right, how do we seek to mitigate the impact of that closure? And like many authorities across the country, the school summer holidays is a period that we do target for works because of reduced traffic flows. And that was borne out again in terms of our traffic flow analysis, that traffic flows, even in the extraordinary times that we're in, did reduce. And so it was the right decision to go in the school summer holidays and try to get the work done within that six-week period. Just to put a bit of context on the scale of what we do, or the network management do here, they do 900 or facilitate 900 temporary road closures each year. and 25,000 applications for street works. So there's a huge workload that's coming in to facilitate all the works that happens across the city. Understand the network management points about other closures and works going on in the area. And that was looked at and checked several times. And here I would draw on the experience and local knowledge of colleagues in that team who know the area as well and are able to understand what the impact may be. It wasn't an easy period for all of us. Leeds Festival is a massive event, as we all know, 90,000 people coming into that part of the city. It has a major impact. From our perspective, what we saw from our systems was that, yes, there were problems at the times that we would expect and in the locations that we would expect, but it wasn't extraordinary above the level that we were expecting. In terms of the FOI, which was another point that's made, I know colleagues are gathering all the information and that's being requested. And I think I probably just need to double check that with colleagues in terms of deadlines. There are deadlines set with these things and we are meeting those. But clearly there's nothing to hide here. We're trying to be as open and honest. I think all I would say here is, whilst there's a few of us here today, this is probably with one or two other colleagues that aren't here. This is a team that is responding to all the requests and incoming calls that were relating to these matters. So it's not a massive team, and we're trying our best to be responsive and to react to the requests that are coming in. And I know the pressure that Rob and his team have been under. In terms of delivering the project, remember this is a major, probably the most significant transport scheme, certainly in my time here at Leeds. And we'll be sat here maybe in a year's time and this scheme will be open. Indeed, many months it will have been opened. And I think that's a major achievement for the team that are involved. Final couple of comments, if I may. In terms of the working group, again, the team are trying to disseminate relevant information as much as possible. Where there are opportunities to engage and have a debate about what options might be, I'm sure Rob and his team will take that on board and has taken that on board. Ultimately, we are trying to implement a scheme that has a planning permission and work to that and to discharge the conditions that that planning permission has given us. So that is the overriding aim, but we are trying to keep the wider community involved as much as possible, and regular updates do go out to quite a large number. I think it's probably thousands, or certainly many hundreds. Again, Rob could confirm that. In summary, in completing all our works and functions as a highway authority, I often talk about a balance that has to be struck. As I think you'll appreciate, Chair, it's very rare that we can please everybody all the time. And invariably, there will be some uncomfortable periods. School summer holidays, we did target for roadworks across the piece, and there are a lot that are taking place, not just our own, but developers and utilities. A great deal of coordination went into it. And from our perspective, we've collectively achieved a lot. We continue to learn though, and if there are lessons to be learned, then I'm more than happy to take those forward. I'll probably leave it there, Chair, and open it up for members to ask questions.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Right, now is the opportunity for members to ask questions. Neil was the first to indicate, and then Jonathan. Neil.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It just seems to me that there are obviously two sides to this, but just referring to what Councillor Robinson was saying, and as I understand, also what perhaps Matthew didn't go into in as much detail is that a lot of people have been pretty upset by the whole situation and the whole process. And it's difficult, I'm not sure whether it's right to say things like this, but I think people have been in tears and quite emotional about it. And so I think we need to bear that in mind. And I think, in my view, I think Gary's made some important points. And he mentioned highway legislation, which is obviously crucial, but and also having nothing to hide, which I think is a very fair comment. But my thought on this, Chair, would be that if we refused to take this forward for future discussions, it just seems to me that any discussions on this can be completely non-confrontational, not seeking some kind of confrontational, but just to literally be seeking a better way in future. And a refusal to take it forward could, in my view, be seen to be quite dismissive of the views of the residents. Thank you, Chair.
Gary, do you want to come back on that, or one of your colleagues?
I'm not opposed to further examination of of process. I think communication is always important. I just think it's really important to understand that in terms of construction projects, particularly one like this, where it's a design and build, where things are moving at pace and things will come out that weren't identified 18, 24 months ago. And the highway authority and the client and the contractor will have to respond to that. I think someone's already said it, residents, businesses are not going to be supportive of road closures for obvious reasons. So undertaking some sort of consultation will just, communication is important in getting that out. You know, we can go into what happened with Leeds Road, and we went above and beyond the normal statutory process for that. But opening up a consultation on all the road closures that we have to facilitate will encumber the service and will cause problems in terms of delivering major projects. But I'm more than happy to have a conversation with Scrutiny around that, Chair. But it is worth noting that if anything was delayed in these sorts of processes and schemes get delayed because of extraneous factors, then the schemes will get subject to compensation events, and contractors will submit those and the schemes will cost more. That's just the way of the world. So it's always a balance, but that's not a reason not to look at things. But my strong recommendation around temporary road closures is that there's a clear legal process, and we go above and beyond that, and we will continue to go above and beyond that. But then to go further, the board and the council need to be aware of what the implications of that would be, and they would be very severe.
Thank you, Gary. Do you want to come back, Neil? Jonathan.
Thanks, Chair. There's a huge amount, I think, to unpack here, and some of it is very relevant to the specific of East Leeds Orbital Road, but I think a lot of it is a lot wider than that. It sort of highlights lots of things, which I perhaps come back to later rather than, when perhaps we discuss how we go forward. But just some specifics to Gary to start with. Would, having been through this objection or this inquiry from Councillor Robinson and the feedback from residents, etc., and you've done a report responding to lots of those issues, would you have done anything with hindsight? And I know it's hindsight, but we can learn from looking back, learn from history. Would you have done anything differently? And you said you're willing to learn lessons from it. Are there lessons that you've found and you are going to learn from it? Because if, I'll let you answer. I'll let you answer those two questions first. Gareth.
With the benefit of hindsight, was the decision to the decision to close the road was a technical one, a construction one. So that decision was sound. And anybody that's been to that particular part of the site will see the level differences and the complexity of the tie-ins with the new road with the existing. So I'm very comfortable that the decision to close the road was sound. You then move on to, right, in terms of implementing and facilitating the road closure to do that, and doing that in the school summer holidays, was that right? And again, I am very comfortable that that decision was sound to do it then, because the reduced traffic flows and our observation of what happened meant that the scheme was delivered successfully on time, even quicker. Actually, we opened it a few days earlier than expected. If we'd undertaken that work outside of that period, the implications for the local community would have been more severe because the schools would have been open. It may have been even longer period of closure because we're into the winter, bad weather, shorter working days. I just think it would have been much more severe. So, yeah, to answer the question, I'm comfortable with the decision. In hindsight, in terms of what lessons learned, communication, I suppose. But again, I look at the work that the team did and the notification that they did. There were certainly instances through the closure in terms of issues with, on one occasion, an ambulance. There was a couple of occasions with the refuse service I'm aware of. Despite our planning, the signing and everything else that's gone in, I think drivers on the ground had some issues. I don't know whether that was a lack of information within their organisation or their parts of the service. So maybe there's something in there. But the fundamental is in terms of decision to close and when to close it, I'm comfortable with the decisions that were taken.
Yeah, so I'm Rob O'Brien. So I'm operating as the project manager for the council on the scheme. Heavily involved with Councillor Robinson and the ELAW working parties and other ward members in and around the scheme. I think we always kind of communicated from the beginning that the success of the scheme was not just about the end product; it was about the journey that we go on. As officers, as groups, as residents, and we've put that across to the contractor, and we're quite passionate about how we operate. Early in 2020, we did communicate the plan with the contractor on what the ambition of the scheme was in terms of how we were going to build it. Where would there be road closures? I think in terms of lessons learned, again, we were trying to be really open in terms of, this is how we're expecting to construct it at the time. As Gary's mentioned, it is a design and build contract. There's still elements of design ongoing at the minute, and all of this was pre-pandemic, which wasn't on the radar either. So the best knowledge at the time that we had as officers, really trying to be open with residents to explain, this is a large infrastructure scheme. We want to try and build it, as much of it as possible without impacting yourselves. And we are in week 89 of 123. And we genuinely stand by the feeling that, we've constructed and made great progress through challenging times, working with the community to minimise disruption. And the 6 weeks of the 123 was a necessity in the end. You know, the design development, the consultation between the contractor and the subcontractors about, you know, constructing the scheme safely, but also keeping residents, pedestrians, cyclists safely moving in and around the works, informed the fact that the road closure was was required. And so in terms of lessons learned, you know, yeah, maybe way back when we were looking at, again, trying to give as much information to residents, to groups about, you know, how are we going to deliver this really challenging large infrastructure scheme. You know, maybe there's a bit of a stop and a pause and understand how much information we're sharing. You know, maybe there could have been more disclaimers to that information. But again, it was only because we were trying our best to let people know that this is how we're going to, you know, try and deliver this challenging scheme through a number of communities, not just in the Harewood ward. So in terms of the communication, we haven't got a large team. We've got some really competent and hardworking officers that are, you know, back on the scheme, and I would absolutely stand by the fact that I believe that compared to other infrastructure schemes that I have seen, that officers are really working hard to go above and beyond to communicate as much as possible to residents, to groups, any stakeholders. You know, we have over 500 people signed up to the ELAW newsletter that we work hard to get out on a monthly basis, again, to keep people informed of the scheme. So yeah, I just think in terms of lessons learned, going further back from where we are now, I think there's maybe something that, you know, I think I could take away with the team, and, you know, with contractors on schemes in the future, where we look at, you know, what that information looks like that goes out to the public initially.
Thank you. Jonathan, you wanted to come back?
I first wanted to come back on Gary's answer, which, to be honest, I was a little bit disappointed with, because at no point, it was all about the decision, about the technical decision, the engineering decision, but there was nothing about looking at the process of how residents were affected. I think that was recovered somewhat by your answer, and you talked about better communications with residents, keeping them informed. Can I just a little sort of anecdote, if you don't mind, just because this is a very familiar situation for me from my previous life. I used to run a unit of a telecoms company, and part of that was managing a network to customers. And I'm not an engineer, but I had an engineering manager who used to look after that bit. And when anything went wrong with the network, he'd come to me and give me a very technical reason why the network had gone down and how they were going to correct it technically. And my question to him always, first question was, what is the customer experiencing? Because that's the important thing, not what going on behind that. That doesn't matter to some extent in terms of the front end. And I think a question you should all be asking when you're doing anything, and this is why I said it's a wider issue than just this particular scheme, is when you're doing something, what is the resident experiencing? And if you understand that, you can then explain it. The resident experience may well be something they don't like, and it's something you can't do anything about. But demonstrate you've thought about it, you've understood it, you've tried, and very often I'm going to ask you sort of a follow-up question in a way, that very often when you're doing something of this magnitude, which is affecting lots of our residents, do you actually have somebody responsible, not as a job they pick up when they've got nothing else to do, but a job, a senior or person with accountability and responsibility that's involved with the planning, and their sole purpose is to go back to the residents, go back to other stakeholders, to not necessarily consultation, because I think sometimes people consider consultations like a vote. I don't want it, I'm going to, but about notification and explanation, and reading this report and just general experience in the council for 10 years, I think we fail on that a lot.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I was trying to cover off in my response the sort of technical side of things, but sort of underlying all that is right. So what is, if you like, going to be the customer experience related to the impact of this closure? And that's when this process of, right, how do we mitigate the circumstances and try to lessen the impact as much as possible. And that's why colleagues in network management engage, and we come to the conclusion that the school summer holidays are appropriate to be looked at. But on top of that, in this instance, there were discussions because of the above and beyond notification that was given, because we knew this would be an issue. We knew that we would receive feedback and that there would be engagement and discussion. And through that process, there have been responses to the issues. So I think additional signs were put up on the diversion route to encourage cars to slow down. All that type of thing was looked at, and trying to address the specific comments that were coming back to us. And that is always an ongoing process. But you do have to tie it back to, you can't change that fundamental decision. Once it's been checked and the engineering need for the closure is accepted by the client, by the highway authority, we then need to move to that next stage. That's what I was trying to get across. But there is all this, to use your language, councillor, the customer experience, and we would probably use something around mitigation for us, but hopefully it's the same thing. Hopefully I've added a bit to my previous answer.
Hi.
Thank you, Chair. And just to add to that as well, once the initial decision has obviously been made for those technical reasons with that customer experience in mind, there is an ongoing process within my team of network management of ongoing monitoring of roadworks. And on this particular occasion, I can go through the process of coordination if members require that in more detail. But once that closure was actually undertaken, I have a team of officers that do continue to monitor the situation. So we don't rely on the assumptions that we make and the judgments that we make before a decision's made. We revisit that continuously through the closure. And I have we've been monitoring the situation through Scholes and Barrick since the start of the closure, during the Leeds Festival as well, and all the way through the process. If you want me to expand on any of the actual data, the actual traffic flows in the area, that might give you a bit more confidence of what the actual impacts were in the villages, I can do that, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you. Just talking about the customer experience and the feedback that you were mentioning, when we did have the sessions with the members of Scholes and yourself, there was obviously given us some notes with some issues, and we did work hard to address those. I mean, one of the major ones was the refuse, and we managed to. And I'm aware there was some teething issues with the first weekend, but after that, it worked well. Another one was the local farmers. We met individual meetings with the farmers and managed to go through their concerns. Being harvest, it was their biggest time of the year, and we made arrangements to do that. So we certainly did listen to the concerns, and when we were able to do something, we made sure we did. As Gary mentioned, a lot of them were just an objection to the closure, which we had accepted. We had done everything we could to find a way around that, and that wasn't possible. Chair,
just for your guidance, Matthew, obviously it's members of the board who ask questions and make comments, but you will be given an opportunity to at least answer one question from me, which may be a vehicle for getting your points across, and secondly, you will have the opportunity to sum up at the end. So hopefully you won't feel as though you haven't had the opportunity to do both of those things. Jonathan, I think you said you wanted to come back possibly later in the discussion, so I'll move on to Councillor Wadsworth.
Thank you, Chair. it's just really your reliance on road closures across the piece, because in the last few years we're seeing so many more road closures than we ever saw before. So has there been a change to legislation, or has there been a change to the policy, or is it being done for a cost basis? Because when I get a road closure in my ward, I challenge them all, and quite often there is nothing that can be done. And sometimes they get changed to nights only. Sometimes they get trimmed back in time. And, you know, we are getting very reliant on road closures and just doing it. And it's sort of understanding the wider impact of road closure, because although this one has now happened and we can't go back, there are more to do on this scheme. And there will be other schemes where road closures are used. And it's a case of understanding from the public that they are absolutely the last resort, and you haven't looked at every other alternative before, or is it just easier to go contractor wants it, grant it, end of?
Through you, Chair. Yeah. The numbers of road closures have been pretty similar for about 4 or 5 years now. They were significantly lower than that, perhaps in 2015 and before that. But for the last few years, they've been quite steady, between 800 and 900. And if projections for this year continue, the number of road closures will rise actually this year, possibly to around 1,000. But just to address the specific questions about the check and the challenge, that is something that goes on continuously. My team, we like to see ourselves as a bit of a policing of the system to ensure that the interests of residents are taken into account. And the primary question we all ask ourselves is, what is the disruption to the road users of the highway network? There are occasions, we don't expect the number of road closures to drop off because of the amount of investment that's been undertaken in the city. But there are occasions where it's rare, we actually require road closures because we made a judgment based on our experience that will actually be a lot less disruptive than another method of traffic management. But that's in the rare cases, I might add. You mentioned night working, weekend working. Those are all factors. Extended working hours, as has been the case on the ELAIL project. There's quite very long shifts being undertaken to try and mitigate that impact on around schools on this occasion. And looking at the monitoring, the effect of the closure, thankfully, has been manageable. It's been a successful project from our point of view. It has obviously been inconvenient for the residents of schools, but they haven't been subjected, at least, to extensive queuing through the village. The highway network has coped well. And just to cover off the point about the coordination as well, we have very robust systems in place to check how schemes interact with one another, not just the locations of the schemes, but also the associated diversions where there are closures. And that's a combination of technology that we use and very experienced officers that are working areas, so they're very familiar with the areas that they work in. So on the coordination point, the system that we have does a sweep of all works within set radiuses up to about half a kilometre. So it covers a very extensive period geography. It also looks at any works that are on the same corridor on the strategic highway network, and it looks at parallel routes as well. All that information is fed to our senior engineers that make a judgment and an assessment of whether or not there will be a clash that will cause effects that we wouldn't want to see. And that's when we start to assess the projects proper, think about the mitigation. And on occasions, it's not seen obviously by members of the public, but we do obviously prevent works, delay works, and affect them in a way that would be much less disruptive than would have been the case had they simply got what they wanted on first application.
Just to comment on the legal position and legislative changes, there have been no recent changes to the relevant legislation relating to making temporary traffic orders. As Gary said earlier, the process is that we have to give a minimum of 7 days notice
by way of a press notice and by way of a notice in the area, at least 7 days before the closure, before the order is made and the closure comes into effect. We also have to notify the police and the fire authorities, and then we have to publish a further notice once the order has been made, confirming that the order has been made. And I think going on from that, if there was to be a review of process, I think that would be the starting point. As Gary and others have said, we have gone above and beyond what we're legally required to do here. I appreciate that's a cold, narrow view of the situation, but we have gone beyond what we're required to do. And I think what we're required to do would be the starting point for any review of the process going forward. Thank you, Chair.
Paul, do you want to come back? Katie, Councillor Dye.
Thank you. My question is actually to Councillor Robinson, so you get your chance now. We're looking at this after the event, and officers have had the opportunity to say whether they would have done anything differently. Have you had any feedback from residents to say whether they would have done things differently, and if so, what is that?
Yes, I have. When we've gone through this process, so what you're hearing is that it's a design and build, which is quite right. That's exactly what it was. When this was first briefed to residents, we were told there would not be a closure on Leeds Road. It was categorical. There was nothing that came forward that said there would ever be a closure on Leeds Road. I think from a resident's perspective, looking back, they're thinking they should have asked some more questions then, because what they've taken is the information at face value. There is a 2 meter drop in the levels that are there. Now, I'm not an engineer, so I don't look into sort of this thing and start to get into it. But now looking back, you can think to yourself, well, of course, there was going to need to be a closure that was apparent there. But that wasn't what was coming from contractors, from officers, from the public. We were accepting the information at face value. So I think that for many residents, they're looking back and saying, well, actually, from what's been delivered, will there be more changes going forward? So I think their thought process now is questioning even more as we've gone through this. I think for some residents, they felt that they need to engage more in the communication process, engage more with officers, with the constructors, and try and work constructively with them. There are some who just don't like the fact that e-law is happening. And I fully respect that view, but I have said to many of them, it is going ahead. You know, it's not going to stop. Actually, what we've got to try and do is work with officers to make sure that it's the best possible scheme and it has the least impact there. Finally, and I'm going to stand up for Gary here, which is not normally what happens when you're in these positions and you're asking for scrutiny to look into the officers in the department. Gary personally intervened to go above and beyond with the health service. You heard what was being said there. We have to inform police and fire. There is no duty to inform health. A resident, and I won't name the resident because that would be remiss of me and unfair. A resident's wife was seriously ill. 3 ambulances tried to get through and couldn't. They ended up with 3 ambulances on site. She was touch and go, unfortunately. Unfortunately, best as I know, she's improving and getting better. Gary personally intervened to make sure that it wasn't just the email was sent, but that they'd seen it at the ambulance service, that they recognized it. And they said, you're going to have to change your routes and get involved. It shouldn't be for the chief officer to have to intervene, but that's one example. Imagine what happens for the others that are going on across the city where we don't do that. I think we need to be better. So in terms of process and my learning, I think we need to be far better. I think this idea that we do things to the legal order is correct, but that should be the minimum. We should be better than that. And finally, Adrian's point about temporary traffic regulation orders. I fully understand that if you get a burst pipe, you're going to need a temporary traffic regulation order and you might have to close the road, and that's going to happen. There's going to be slight changes. This is a £200 million road project. You can plan ahead for this sort of stuff, and you can work through it. And I think that's why I'm not looking at this. And there are things that we can learn for every process across the city, but this is a scheme where you can boil it down to a microcosm and you can say, well, there are real impact here. There's real impact on what we can really learn coming out the other side and make a difference for future projects.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to go back slightly there, so where I talked about lessons learned and the kind of construction phasing that we presented to councillors and working parties way back when. We didn't make a statement in there that there would be categorically no road closures. There's a reference in there that we would try and build the junction with minimal road closures. We would require a closure at the tie-ins, obviously where the new junction ties into the existing network. Inevitably there has to be some form of closure to allow us to construct that safely. So yeah, I don't think we ever said that they absolutely wouldn't be a closure. I don't think we ever stated that there would be a 6-week closure to build the full junction. Yeah, I just wanted to make that point. I think going back to the ambulance service as well, Gary did intervene and try and communicate higher up the chain in the health service, absolutely. But I would say as well that officers back on site were also trying their utmost and relentlessly trying to communicate with the ambulance service. And I think we found out that that organisation has got some issues that they need to review internally. So again, we went over and above that would not typically happen. So it wasn't just an email that was sent, a cold email, it was phone calls, you know, people were trying to chase the right people. So I just wanted to put that across to the board.
Chair, and if I, sorry, Adrian, I just add in onto the comment about the ambulance service, really, because it's not just about us learning from this very large project. You know, we always seek to learn from all our projects, and I always talk at my SMT about continuous improvement needed, and that approach to be taken. But I just wanted to say that we've offered our services, our expertise on the way we look at roadworks across the piece to the ambulance service, because we have specialist software that we use, which personally, without knowing all the detail, I think would be of huge benefit to them too. And I've offered Adrian services to have a sort of tutorial with them to show what we do and how we manage it. And so they will be able to see readily all the road closures and all the road works that are going on across the city. So I just wanted to make Scrutiny aware of that it's not just us, that we're trying to help the wider partners as well.
Yeah, just to come back on that point, that was the point I was going to raise. We have invested in this system called One.Network, which Gary refers to. That contact and offer has been made to the ambulance service, so we've offered to give them a tutorial on how it's used. It's a system that the public can use as well, and it very effectively pulls across the information on road restrictions, not just closures, restrictions as well, onto sat navs and things like that. So we've invested in that, and it is a useful tool, and it can be, its functionality is also such that you can check on the day that you're traveling, but you can also check up to a year in advance as well, and all the information that we have obviously up to that period can be displayed on the system. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Katie, do you want to come back? Okay, so I think Councillor Shazad.
First of all, my apologies to yourself, Chair, and to Councillor Robinson and the officers for being late. Well, you've stolen most of my thunder there, Councillor Robinson, regards emergency services, because we had an issue up in Chapel Allerton as well with the temporary flower pot closures, where a fire engine couldn't make it. So I was wondering, how can the highways department, like you said, you have got that new system, and how you can make it readily available to the residents, and especially the emergency services, because on this occasion, it wasn't the ambulance service, it was actually the fire department that could not get to a house. The house got burnt down, but luckily there was nobody in there and there was no casualties. But especially when it comes to temporary road closures, that's something we definitely need to look at before we actually have a major emergency where somebody actually loses their life because the ambulance or the fire service can't get there on time. And the other thing I'd like to congratulate Robert on is when he did our part of the ELAW scheme, they were very good at communicating with us
I mean, you can't keep everybody happy, the residents or the business owners. And in the Moortown ward, we had a lot of that, and Councillor Buckley sharing the opposite ward with us, the Al Woodley ward. But I saw the ELAW team, they were very responsive to us. Within hours, they would reply to our emails, and any residents or businesses that had issues, they were very forthcoming in helping with those issues. And I mean, as long as the engagement's good, and unless the staff has changed in the ELAW team, normally we found them very good. And I hope your experience with them down in schools improves as well. But we found them, I mean, I'm sure Councillor Buckley will probably agree on that, because we had no problems. And there were design issues with our scheme as well, because sometimes engineers don't pick up things. I mean, like you're talking about gradients, we had an issue with our roundabout on the ring road, where obviously there was a gradient issue where they had to do extra work and had to work at night and do road closures. So they were very good in that sense. But again, consultation, what we can look at is, especially on an ongoing scheme, it depends when the consultation is done and if it's done in a timely manner. Because we did, I mean, sorry to pick on you, Gary, we did have a scheme up in Hare Hills where consultation was done, but the actual scheme was delivered too late, where the whole road had changed in essence, because it from a mere residential road, it become a road with lots of businesses, and changes had taken place. And because the consultation was old, it was obviously of no value to the scheme when it actually went in. And looking at other schemes, they could have been done better. So I think going forwards with this scheme, obviously, as long as there's up-to-date consultations that they can do with yourself, ward members, residents, and I'm sure you'll have residents groups up in schools, and I'm sure the ELAW scheme they will work with yourselves. And but I do worry about how we're going to communicate with the emergency services and how we plan ahead, because obviously there's major parts of this scheme still to be delivered, like you said. So it's something that I think the officers should go back and the ELAW team should look at. But I mean, with the whole process, I'm not going to make a decision, but from what I've seen and the way they've communicated with our bit of the ELAW scheme was really well done, really well handled, and we had no issues with communication or consultation, to be honest. So that's my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Councillor, and I'm sure Rob will take that back to the team very gladly. So thank you for those. And I'm quite happy. I'm going to look at Adrian here in terms of this contact with the emergency services and how they take the information we give around our road closures and works and what they do with it. And I think there's something there that we can perhaps do this tutorial to, perhaps not just the ambulance service, but perhaps offer it to the fire as well, possibly the police, because this is not a scrutiny of emergency services that aren't here. But I must admit, the information I was receiving about how they took our information was a bit of a surprise to me. I thought they would have X, Y, and Z. And then it became apparent that it was perhaps not as sophisticated, if I may put it that way, as I thought it was going to be. And that's why I've offered Adrian to do a tutorial to the ambulance service on this one network. And I'm more than happy to ask Adrian to pick that up and widen it out, because absolutely, and that's why I got involved. We don't do this road closures to make life difficult for residents or businesses. We want to get the work done safely for the contractors and for the general public. That's why we're doing this. And the last thing anybody wants is a problem with the emergency services trying to access an emergency. So as I say, I'm more than happy to take that away.
And just to confirm that the One Dot Network system is available on the council's webpage as well. I think Gary may have written to members recently, and there's actually a link in the letter to that particular system if people are struggling to find it.
Mohammed, do you want to follow up on anything there?
Yeah, I would have followed up saying if the public can be aware, and especially the residents around schools and where we're doing that work regarding the One Dot Network, so they're actually aware of any closures and temporary roadworks, especially in that area. I mean, I don't know if they're going to be easily aware that the one network exists.
Well, we can certainly, I think, add it to the newsletter that we send out, so that's not a problem. We can send a link to Becky, if that's all right, and send it around this board as well. As I say, it's open to the public, it's there, but more than happy to provide the link, so that's not a problem.
Thank you. Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. I think if we accept that now that the decision was needed to be taken to close the road and that the process around that was followed correctly, Gary. But I think many of us have issues with the communication that followed it. Matt said it actually, you know, the legislation that you mentioned is the bare minimum that you have to follow. And given the extent of the disruption that this was caused, then maybe going above and beyond even what you did was probably needed. And officers have been kind of reflective in that manner in the meeting. It isn't reflected in your responses in the report. And I found this to be quite a direct response. I don't think I've ever seen each point be answered in a report in the manner in which this one has. And I think a bit more contrition in the offset might have had a few more of our backs down rather than against the wall on this coming into this meeting. Councillor Bentley mentioned, is there someone specifically answering comms messages on these things? I mean, I think from my experience, it tends to just be the engineer that gets sent the messages and the engineer is required to reply. I think if we considered looking outside of the box going forward, you know, the comms team, I find just churn out press releases. They could be seconded onto some of these things to triage the messages, get the replies to residents in a timely fashion. Electoral services write to every household every year, reminding them that they can sign up for a postal vote and get on the electoral register. And you've mentioned a number of times, or officers have mentioned a number of times, that a newsletter goes out to residents on this. So it's not beyond the capability to make people aware as soon as a decision is made that a road needs to be closed. And I don't think anyone is asking for consultation on these things, but you can usually carry the majority of people along with you if you give them enough time and enough notice that they can, if something they are planning is going to be disrupted, that they can make alternate arrangements. We all accept that you can't please everybody, and I don't think anyone knows it more than the people at this end of the table. But you know, there is things that can be learned from this. Hindsight has been mentioned, and I don't think on that we're at the point where we accept that you're going to take something away from this and improve the process. I mean, Matt's story about the ambulance is case in point. Are we going to have something from this session today that the policy of Leeds is going to change, that the ambulance service is going to be notified on these things, regardless of what the legislation says? It's fire and police at the moment. Are we going to go above and beyond that in future anyway? For something as significant as this, are we going to make sure that that extra communication, written communication, potentially goes out? Because as I've said, it's not beyond this council to be able to do it. Thank you.
Just for the avoidance of doubt, through you, Chair, on just so there's no sort of, we've not explained ourselves correctly on the ambulance point. The ambulance service is notified on every single closure that is undertaken by the council. I don't know if it's come across as this was an exception, but on every closure that we carry out in the city, they are notified of that in advance.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Councillor. Just in terms of the communication, again, as Councillor Shazad has mentioned earlier, the team have been working on this project for 3 or 4 years now. And like my statement earlier regarding, you know, the success of the scheme is not just about the end product, it is about the journey that we go on. And I think the team hasn't changed. We haven't got a massive team, and we've got some really, you know, competent, passionate officers back at the office that haven't just communicated well during the phase 1 of the scheme, the initial junction improvements, but have continued in the phase 3, because we don't want local residents and stakeholders to have anxieties and concerns. I think looking at item 4.1 in the engagement element, as soon as we've challenged the process, not just internally on site in terms of the engineering mindset, but also with the network management team, you can see that there's 7 or 8 weeks in advance of the closure that we're communicating this information to people. So we're absolutely giving as much notice as is possible. Obviously, with engineering and construction, things change. You've got to be careful. I think Councillor Shazad mentioned a full street changed, but as the information is developed, this timeline again is over and above what a typical engineering scheme would do. So I think in terms of communication response times, there is a standard duration for reply, but again, I can absolutely state that the team are turning communications around, within a matter of 1 or 2 days, sometimes on the day. They really want to keep people informed, and if people have got queries and concerns about the scheme, we want to make sure that they're fully aware of what is going on, make sure that their understanding is correct, because on schemes like this, people do come to assumptions, and we've been open from the start to to ask as many questions as possible. So yeah, I just wanted to try and almost defend the team, because council officers, I cannot explain how hard they are working at this, so I just wanted to make that clear to the board.
Just very briefly, Chair, communications is really key, isn't it? We've learned that in recent years, and we've developed the Connecting Leeds brand, which some of you will be very familiar with. Certainly it's part of the city centre work that we've been doing, but we've broadened that out, and that team has grown to support our comms team here, which, as Councillor Taylor said, has a slightly different function. But it's such a broad area of work, and there's so much work going on that we can keep adding resources and resources to it. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is we recognise the importance of communications. We're still learning about that. We're adding resource into it, but as I say, we're seeking to continuously improve. But it is the expectation out there in terms of communication is so high that it's difficult to keep up. But through the efforts of officers, certainly within this team, we're trying as best we can, but I'm sure there are lessons to be learned.
Do you want to come back, Jonathan?
Just a very brief comment. I appreciate that, Gary and Rob as well. And I don't mean it to sound as if officers and engineers don't respond to people, because I know from an engineer that covers our area that replies do come very quickly, but something has obviously gone wrong here. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sat here discussing it today. And I think if you would, as I say, a bit more of a reflection on what has been said in terms of communications of what we as members are asking for on behalf of our residents, as I mentioned, maybe look at the comms team and say, listen, this thing has got the potential to avalanche on top of us. It's not what we planned for, and it's not what residents are expecting at the moment. There's been kind of mixed messages as to whether people thought that the roads would close ever, or if they would never close, or whatever. But this was obviously such a significant change to how people were going to be getting about that. Maybe, as I say, a bit of thinking outside of the box might have helped avoid coming to this place now. But just a comment, Chair, rather than wanting anything back. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Neil Buckley.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to make the point, actually, and ask one question about this business about the ambulance service, because it just seems to me, listening to that if nothing came out of this morning except the new system of communication with the ambulance service, that would be a positive. We sometimes come to these meetings thinking, oh, well, we're going to have a go, and these are the baddies, and they're going to have to explain themselves. And actually, it becomes more nuanced the more you go into it. And I just wanted to clear up this, actually, because have the ambulance service committed themselves to coming to a tutorial? because the rather diplomatic way that Gary put it, that other organisation systems might not be quite as modern as they should be, is an interesting one. And I think the other services should commit themselves to this meeting if they haven't already done.
I'll certainly take that away. The ambulance service have expressed an interest, and I've followed that up, and I'll make sure that encompasses all the emergency services now. But that's something I'll take away from this meeting, definitely.
And just for the avoidance of doubt, just to repeat Adrian's comment earlier, whenever we do anything significant on the network, whether it's temporary or permanent, and I can see traffic colleagues here, we always involve all the emergency services, just because the legislation on temporary closures says fire and the police. We don't just do that, we go above and beyond. So we always, I just wanted to reiterate that so members are reassured, because that's vital.
Thank you. Councillor Bentley.
Thanks, Chair. Just a couple of questions on the same issue, the emergency service or the ambulance service. This occurred on this scheme because of road closures, and an ambulance wasn't able to get through to a patient. We're doing road closures all the time for years and years. Is this the first time that we've had this issue that an ambulance has not been able to get through? And if it isn't, well, we should have sorted it out before now. And my second question is, I understand fortunately or unfortunately, I don't have any major road works like this going through my ward, but I understand there's a working group. Are the emergency services involved in that as a stakeholder in what's happened? Because then you could flag up quite a lot of these issues in advance.
I'll let perhaps Rob come back on whether the emergency services are part of the newsletter. In my time here, it's not funny, but coincidentally, I have received another piece of correspondence in the last week about a potential similar incident, not on this scheme, but elsewhere. So I think that doubles my request to Adrian to make sure that, as long as all we can do, we can't tell other emergency services how to operate. That's up to them and their chief officers and executives. But we can show our best practice, and let's see where that goes, and we will do that. In my time here, I think there has been certainly one incident with a major event that was claimed. But that's going back a few years, and there was an inquiry into that, or an investigation into that. But if further information is needed, I'll have to look into it. But from my perspective, it's certainly not a common occurrence, and we always make sure that, as I say, consultation or notification takes place, and that our road closures are well signed, so that there's no avoidance of doubt in terms of where people should be going and shouldn't be going.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the working groups, we have a number of working groups. So obviously the scheme is 7 kilometres long, and it goes through a number of different wards and communities. So we've got around 3 different community working groups, and they are specifically with local residents and interested stakeholders. We absolutely do include all of the emergency services as part of any communication we send out, and they are key stakeholders of ours. So are the likes of Metro, the bus operators locally. But I think from my experience going, when we before the pandemic, and we used to go to a lot of these meetings in public, the emergency services, they're clearly struggling from a resource perspective as well. And obviously that's not nothing that we can control. So I suppose the way that they operate and the way they attend meetings and are able to digest information that comes in, I'm sure it is a challenge within their organisations as much as it is within Leeds City Councils. But in terms of as a project, and not just this project, I know within the rest of the civil engineering major schemes team, we absolutely communicate early about planned works and during the works and after if needs be. There were well in advance signs out on the network as well. Obviously, we use social media, we send emails, we chase up with phone calls. There were advanced signs with the information on as well. So yeah, we have asked those questions of the emergency services, and there's definitely, I think, lessons to be learned from other organisations as well.
Do you want to come back? Councillor Hussain.
Yeah, thank you very much. A couple of things. Learning a lesson and moving it forward, I think that should be for me as a councillor, not for the department, because as a Leeds City councillors, we are relying onto the chief and senior officers to make sure they are following everything, and not to the each scheme we are learning a lessons or moving it forward. That's not good enough, be honest with you, for me, for the Gifting and Hair Health, and I'm sure we all are here to responsible persons for across the city, right? And the emergency services, I think that it should be. It doesn't matter to me, be honest with you, Chair, is any local residents making any objections, yes or not? Elected members are putting any contribution, yes or not? That should be a party from the departments, because as a local authority, we are responsible to provide emergency service to every single citizens of Leeds. And thus it doesn't matter if it's a road closures or even introducing any schemes where the ambulance service, fire, brigade, police, and also refugees are getting a difficulty. That's making a life hard and costing somebody's, could be costing somebody's life. And I think that's, it's an over responsibility, and also department, because it doesn't matter to me, be honest with you, Chair, but I'm going to repeat, well, it should be a first priority. It doesn't matter in my ward across the city, emergency services should be priority for any schemes. It doesn't matter if it's a closer or we are providing any scheme for the future across the city. And what the Councillor Shazad was saying, right, yes, it's a number of the times been raised with the highways regarding other emergency services in my ward. And after 7 years, we're here and we're talking about, are we going to learn the lesson and we're going to move on? And I think that's not right, and that's not a way as a professional or as a Leeds City councils. That's, it's, to me, it's not good enough at all. I'm no expert. That's not my everyday Monday to Friday job. We have a department over there. We have a senior officer, chief, everybody here, and thus they should be accountable for closure and for any new schemes for the emergency services.
Thank you, Arif. Do you want to come back on that, Gary, please?
Well, just to confirm that health and safety is of the paramount importance and consideration for everything we do. And the closure was enacted because we wanted to ensure the safety of not only the people carrying out the work, but also the general public who might have been using that part of the highway. And it's our number one consideration as a service, and certainly within my management team. I'm sure colleagues will recall me saying it many times. The most important thing I expect of them day in, day out is for them to arrive safely at work, carry out their duties safely for the benefit of everybody in the community, and then they go home safely. And that is the most important thing that we have as a service. So it's just to reassure that it's right up there, and nothing is more important. And that's why we do consult, we do notify, and in this instance, we went above and beyond quite considerably what is expected of us, because we heard the local concerns that were made very, very clearly to us by councillors, quite rightly, and we responded.
Arif, do you want to come back? I've not had any more indications, so before I move to the officers and request them to sum up, and then Matthew, I have a question that might also allow you to elaborate on the points you've been making. Obviously, consultation is a word that we bandy about all the time within the community, within amongst politicians. But what specifically could have been done in this particular case, and maybe in other future ones, to improve the overall process? Because at the moment, we've got this vague notion that it didn't go right, that we could have done better. But what, from your perspective as a ward member and representing your residents, would you have thought we should have been done?
So in discussion with the director and with Rob as the project manager, there were a number of suggestions around this particular road closure that we offered and said to them could be taken forward. Those, in defence of the officers, those were looked at and reviewed, but not taken forward. I think that was a missed opportunity. I think they could have been, but you know, that's been and gone. In terms of specific improvements, I think there's definitely communication that needs to be improved from this. Rob mentioned, I think about 500 people are on the mailing list. This scheme covers my ward, Crossgates and Winmore, Temple Newsham, Councillor Dye's ward, it's Moortown ward, it's in our Woodley ward. For 500 people to be on it suggests that we haven't communicated very well. We've not got that message out there. And the second part to that is I would hope that from today that there's an opportunity for the board and for residents to feed into the process as well. I think it would be a missed opportunity from today to almost kick the ball back to the department and say, well, you know, what would you do differently? Looking back, I think there's an opportunity for the board to feed in a scrutiny, and the weight that scrutiny will add to Adrian's arm means that emergency services will take more of account of it. I think quite often what we know is that stakeholders will get sent the notice in the email and it'll get read but not actioned. Actually, what I'm keen to have is action on the back of it.
Okay, thanks very much. Most of what I wanted to raise, well, all of what I wanted to raise has been raised already by board members. So coming back to the officers, this is your opportunity, 5 minutes or so to sum up if you so wish, before I move to summation from Councillor Robinson.
I think most of it's been covered, Chair. Maybe it's just an opportunity just to cover off a point that was made that I didn't come back on. I think it was Councillor Bentley who used the words that an ambulance didn't get through. Well, just for clarity and accuracy, the ambulance did get through. One of the ambulances did get through. Unfortunately, 2 of them did go to the point of the closure, having not followed the signs, but one did get through. So just, as I say, not making a point, just for accuracy. In summation, I think it's all been covered, but I suppose once that decision was made for the closure, if the school summer holidays was the key here, because that was the key mitigation effect. And I suppose in an ideal world, if that had been a bit later and we had more time to get more communications out, I still honestly believe, though, that some individuals were just dead against the closure of Leeds Road for various reasons. And no matter the level of communication, consultation, notification we would have done, we would be probably still sat here because that decision for a closure was still there. And then finally, just to come back on the newsletter, 500 people on it. That's a voluntary thing where people, if they're interested in the scheme, can sign up. So it's for them to come to us, really. More than happy to work with councillors in the relevant area to spread the word and get more people on that. That's not a problem. But I think most of it we've discussed at length in, I think, 2 hours now. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Matthew.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't intend to go over lots of old ground and what's already been discussed. I think the takeaways from this that I'd be keen for the board to look at and consider in how they take forward is looking at communication, getting communication right, making sure that we do that not just externally but internally as well. It was mentioned about the refuse service not getting through. I mean, it wasn't for a lack of notice that they didn't get through. Obviously, it went to somebody and it was not actioned. So I think there's things we can do externally to communicate and internally. I think there's a collaboration process, how we work collaboratively with external partners and stakeholders, but with residents too. The point made by Councillor Bentley, this customer focus, and when I opened, I said, a citizen focus to this. I think that we have to come back to that, and I fully appreciate from an officer's perspective, they need to deliver the scheme and get the scheme done, and they want to make sure that they try and take as many people with them as possible. I think the duty is on us as councillors to think about that citizen impact that comes alongside it, and to keep that in check too. And finally, that ELAW is a huge project as well, and we can look at it as one in isolation to learn things from and improve practice elsewhere. I think to try and look at it as highways across the city is almost too unwieldy, which is why I looked at it at Leeds Road and ELAW specifically. The only last comment I would make is that I don't think any officer of this council wakes up in the morning and thinks, do you know what, I fancy doing a rubbish job today. I don't think any single one of them wakes up and says, do you know, I want to make life a bit more difficult for some of the residents of Leeds today. I actually think they do want to make improvements here, and our job as councillors is to try and help make that improvement with them. I think to just kick it to the highways team and say, go back and come up with some answers would be remiss. I think there's more that we need to do as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Matthew. Right, we reached the stage where we've got to decide how we proceed on this. And I don't think it's an issue of whether we do any more work or we don't. I think the consensus is perhaps we do need to follow up on this. But my suggestion from the chair, for what it's worth, is that we have had a point-by-point discussion both in the reports, and we've had the opportunity for the last 90 minutes or so to rehearse a lot of the concerns, which have a wider connotation than just this specific project. And I think we're grateful to Matthew for bringing this to us. So could I suggest something along the lines that we do look at this at a future meeting on the basis of hopefully developing some sort of protocol, for a want of a better expression. And that protocol, I think, would largely be a statement of what highways already do and have done, but it would be complemented and enhanced by the lessons learned in this particular instance and the issues that we have members together with Matthew and the wider community have raised. That would then enable a report to come to a future scrutiny board, not just for our discussion, but one which would be a public document and obviously open to comments from the citizens of Scholes, from all ward members, either those affected by this particular instance or more widely. And hopefully that would then form the basis of what highways and maybe other departments have lessons to learn as well, as we all know from our experiences as members, but that highways could share with the public, with ward members, with parish councils, and say, this is what you can expect of us as we roll this project forward. Does that sound like a reasonable way of approaching it? Jonathan?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think that sounds really appropriate. I mean, from our discussion, I think we're not entirely clear as to the process that highways follow when they're looking to close a road. And to have a document in front of us which we can look at and say, okay, well, this sounds good, but really we think you should also be doing this as a rule on each one. I think highways do need to come back and present that to us. So I mean, I'd be happy to second your proposal there.
Just to be clear, I think my proposal goes wider than just the process for road closures. It talks about significant, and how you define significant, of course, is going to be in the eye of the beholder, but our significant projects will unfold, so that there is a starting point that we can share with members, with the public, parish councils, etc., to say, you know, this is something that you can hold us to if we don't undertake these particular steps. But I dare say that 95% of that document is already written in terms of what has been done. It's just the 5% that needs elucidating and improving upon. That would be my perception. Mohammed?
Yeah, would the report back include how the Highways Department is going to work with other emergency services in actually taking that information forward with the road closures and the impacts?
I think it's got to, hasn't it? Because it's an issue that we focused on. It's an issue we've raised. Sure, officers have noted all those points. Becky will have noted them, and they will be in the minutes. So yeah, I would assume that it has to embrace that, because we have a rule, a duty of care, don't we, to our residents, whether we run the service directly or not. So would that be an acceptable way forward? Everyone in agreement with that? Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Matthew. Thank you, citizens of Skulls, and thank you, officers, for coming along and responding to our questions, as well as the detailed point-by-point report, which was partly down to the chair's request, Matthew, if you want. Okay, right, moving on. So we'll allow Matthew and the officers to depart from the top of the table, those who need to, and I think we've got a couple of other officers coming in. Okay. Sorry, we're just having a short pause while Becky asks the officers to undertake their house cleaning duties.
Chair, if it's okay with you, to sit in for certainly the early parts of this one. I may have to go to Sturton fairly
Okay.
quickly. So, but
Well, I will be following you probably in
okay.
due course, Gary. Right, I think we have only one officer joining us. Is it David?
It is, yes.
David, if you could just introduce yourself to the board.
Hi, I'm David O'Donoghue, Principal Transport Planner for Leeds City Council.
Okay, thanks very much. And before we launch into this particular subject, I did have an email, well, sorry, Becky did have an email from Councillor Hayden giving her apologies. She was intending to attend today, but last minute childcare issues prevented that. So obviously she would have been here otherwise to hear our deliberations. Right, okay, moving on to the powered two-wheeler use of bus lanes issue. Clearly, this is something that the board has discussed on a number of occasions over the last 2 years. More recently, we've had two fairly lengthy discussions, one in an online board meeting and one in a subsequent working party where we invited Councillor Illingworth as ward member who'd objected to the proposal, and 4 representatives of the Motorcycle Action Group. As the notes indicate, we did take a vote, an indicative vote at the end of the working party meeting, and that was inconclusive. So I felt that it needed to come back to the board for any further discussion, hopefully not one that starts from square one of the issue, and that we took a substantive vote about whether our recommendation would be for the A65 trial to continue. And that was the focus of our previous discussion and the working group, not to open up the whole issue of the wider context. So I don't know, before proceeding to that vote, obviously I'd like to give all board members who wish it the opportunity to indicate their view, how they want to proceed, and to explain that, hopefully briefly. Okay, so I think, Neil, you've indicated you wanted to contribute.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And relatively briefly, actually, but this has been going on years, hasn't it? Years and years and years. And it seems such a reasonable, to me, and straightforward proposal. And I just made 1 or 2 literally very brief comments. And on the opening page of this agenda item, it does say actually that local ward members in Kirkstall are not supportive of the scheme. But actually, we've sort of heard, or we certainly haven't heard anything from the other two ward members, it seems to me. And the papers are full of what Councillor Illingworth thinks. Now, I respect what Councillor Illingworth's opinions are, but he is only a third of the members in his own ward. Secondly, it's only a trial. It's not as if this is going to be imposed as a blanket decision on the whole city or the whole county or whatever. It's literally a trial. Thirdly, blood bikes. That seems to me to be a really excellent way of assisting them in doing this great work. And it just seems to me that there's a little bit of a feeling running through this that cycling is good, but motorcycling is bad. It just seems to be prejudiced in some way. And final comment, Chair, the fact that this whole process then finished with a working group being appointed, yet more bureaucracy. And then at the end of the working group's deliberations, that was inconclusive. And it just seems to me that we have to make up our minds and just say, yeah, have a trial. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Neil. Just to be clear to anyone observing this meeting, the working group wasn't an attempt to kick the issue into the long grass. We do have over time changes in the personnel on this board, and there were a number of new members who weren't party, as we have been, to the very lengthy discussion, detailed discussion. So to bring it to a head and to ensure that everyone was up to speed, and we were answering further questions that board members had raised, that was why we had the working group. Jonathan.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. I don't recall the working group being appointed. I think everyone was open to volunteer to come to it, as they always are. So I think if you wanted to have your voice, you should come to the working group. And it just comes back to the point I think we made at the first meeting, the online meeting, and at the working group, that what would be the outcome of this trial? All it would show is the impact of using a bus lane on the A65. If you wanted to make it wider, which the Motorcycle Action Group kept wanting to do, talk about other areas, other reasons, this trial wouldn't inform issues across the rest of the city. So doing a trial on the A65, I think would just be a waste of time and money for the council. If you want to do something else, I've got nothing against motorcyclists, it might be a great idea, but let's do something that's going to actually produce some results that can be used in the future. And third point, I think blood bikes, no issue with blood bikes like an emergency service. And I think perhaps we should just do some more investigation on that. I don't think we should let it muddy the water on this decision. Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Wadsworth.
I mean, I should be voting in favour of a trial. We've gone on so long. Until we have the outcome of a trial, we won't know what we're doing. And I appreciate Councillor Bentley is conscious of the cost of a trial, but if we don't have a trial on the A65, which we are told is the only corridor at the moment that we could have that trial, we won't ever know. So if we say no today, we'll never know. I'm pretty confident we'll come back at some point in time. These things tend to do so. But if we get the trial up and running, get the trial out of the way and evaluate it, we will then know, and we will have a much clearer picture.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I also agree. I think that this has gone on for so long now that, I mean, we kind of risk looking like we can't make up our minds on things. And I mean, we know on the board that personnel change, but I mean, for a large part, you know, there is a core of us who have been discussing this now for the better part of 2 or 3 years. You know, stakeholders have been consulted on this, and for the most part, apart from the ward councillor, were supportive, and that includes the bus companies that were consulted as well. Councillor Bentley mentions, what is the outcome of this? I mean, the outcome of this is to determine how we influence future infrastructure and how it's developed in the city. I mean, if it comes across that this enables us to cut some congestion on the road where bus lanes are going to be introduced, because the A65 is wide enough to accommodate this, then that has to be the standard that we look to go forward to allow motorcycles to enter bus lanes as infrastructure is developed. I mean, amending current infrastructure may be beyond what we're able to achieve financially or even practically on some roads, but we do have parts of bus lanes where all traffic can enter at some time, so we do have to consider that, I think, and I think that the costing was relatively minimal from what I recall in comparison to some of the schemes, particularly the last scheme that we were discussing. So I'll also be voting in favour of a trial. This has gone on for too long.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Arif.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can understand this is a trial. Trial is a trial, but I think this is the main issue to me in here, Chair, is health and for the safety reason. Safety reason is, I think, is more important. It doesn't matter is a trial, how much is it going to cost? Because we all know the A65 is a really, really busy road. It doesn't matter if it's bus lines or anything else. And also, I know that you, Chair, stopped me last time as well. If onto the same part of the A65, the private hire are going to say, give us this for a trial, right? And it will be a massive, massive issue across the city then, right? And I know personally, right, it's more than 5,000 private hire badge holder, license holder by the Leeds City Councils. And I think we needed to look at that too, right? It could be a proposal by the private hire for the trial. So that's why I'm not in favor of this at all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Gittins.
Chair, obviously I'm new onto this onto the scrutiny board, but I was amazed when I first read the first papers I received, see this had been discussed for nearly 2 years. And I think obviously it's controversial, it's emotive, but you need the evidence and you need the facts, and therefore I think this trial should take place.
Okay, Councillor Dye.
I find this quite a difficult thing to come to a decision on, and I can see why we've kicked it around for so long, because I think both for and against arguments are really quite strong. For me, the strongest argument to say let's not have a trial is that we can't extrapolate the data and we can't learn more than just about that section. And so I think that's a pretty strong argument. But the arguments for having the trial, I think, are also quite sound in that we won't know anything unless we have a trial. And that for me is slightly stronger. And I think we need to look also to the future. We may not be able to extrapolate the data to current bus lanes in the city, but we might be able to use the data in future planning if we have positive outcomes from the trial. So I will be voting to go for a trial.
Okay, thank you. Karen.
Thank you, Chair. Obviously, I'm new to this board regarding this issue, and I just wondered how it's going to be monitored and who will monitor who's using that lane, because now we get electric scooters about, there'll be more than just cyclists so wanting to use that specific lane. So I just wondered who was going to monitor it and be responsible.
Though we have covered all these issues previously, I'm still going to ask the officers to respond to that question, but also the reference to the blood bikes, because we all as members of the board did receive an email from that particular organisation, and I think we are, we're sympathetic towards it. So it would be helpful if we could be told, not necessarily in respect of this trial, but what the logistics would be of enabling that particular organisation, given the absolutely crucial work they do, to be made an exception more generally. But I don't want the debate to go down that path, because we are focusing on whether we have the trial on the A65 or not.
So the first part of that is around monitoring and evaluation, and the trial will have interviews with key stakeholders. Post implementation, we'll record behaviours, speeds, data linked to buses and the impact that any delays might have. So there'll be a wide ranging monitoring evaluation package on all road users, so cyclists, pedestrians, motorcycles, and the public transport network as well. So we have done consultation prior to this already to seek feedback and made them aware of that as well. So the second part was about white nights and the blood bikes. So we're not currently at a position to understand the scale of that, because that's the request is for access to all bus lanes across Leeds. Now, as all the guidance states, it's and why this is such a difficult issue is that each bus lane is different in terms of width, road characteristics, and all guidance says you need to take the review of the bus lanes and who accesses them on a case-by-case basis. We are aware that Bradford do allow that, and the White Knights access to the bus lane. So I have a meeting with Bradford tomorrow and West Yorkshire to understand a little bit more about what they've done. But ultimately, the logistics, we would have to change all the bus lane traffic regulation orders to allow them access. It's also worth noting as well that we have different bus lanes. There's guided bus lanes in Leeds as well, up Scottle Road and York Road. So there's a full investigation that we need to do.
Okay, thank you, David. Right, moving to the crucial part of the meeting, and I'm going to take votes on two elements, because if you remember at the working group, I suggested that we might give an initial indication to the executive board about segregated routes in future, and the A647 and the A61, A639 should be considered possible access points in the future to kind of move forward on that. So I'll take a separate vote on that particular element. And for the benefit of observers of this meeting, we are not the decision makers. We've looked at this issue over 2 years. We can only make a recommendation. The ultimate decision rests with senior members of council and senior officers. So without any further ado, I'm going to move to a vote on whether we support the trial on the A65. And I'm going to go through members alphabetically. So Councillor Bentley.
Not supported.
Okay. Councillor Buckley. Councillor Dye, I think you've already indicated, haven't you? Councillor Gettings, I think you've already. Councillor Goddard. Councillor, I think he's gone, is he? Right, okay. Councillor Renshaw. Councillor Shazad.
I'm not in spot.
Okay. Councillor Taylor. Councillor Me, I'm supportive. Councillor Wadsworth.
Supportive, Chair.
I think that's an overwhelming cross-party support for the recommendation. Oh, yeah, don't celebrate too soon. This issue is a bit like a boomerang. Okay, moving on to the initial indication and recommendation regarding how future segregated cycleways might be treated. I think there was genuine acceptance of that, but I'll go through. Councillor Bentley? Yeah, Councillor Buckley? Councillor Dye? Yes. Councillor Gettings? Councillor Goddard? Councillor Renshaw? Councillor Shazad? Councillor Taylor? I'm supportive, and Councillor Wadsworth. Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much for that. The final item, or substantive item, is the work programme. I don't know if there are any issues that any member wants to raise, but normally we note this as it's a work in progress based on, and obviously we will add to the work programme the request for highways to come back with the sort of protocol document that arose from our previous discussion. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your attendance. It's nice to see everyone face to face. I'm not going to overstate that because we'll soon get used to it, won't we? But thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you.